Good morning and welcome to Star USA Training. Today is Tuesday, February 15th, and we will be talking about anti-dumping and countervailing duties. We're recording the webinar. The slides, the recording, and any other materials will be made available after the broadcast. All participants are muted. There is a Q&A feature available. If you have questions, you can type them in throughout. Michael will also save them if you note that they are for Stump the Speaker at the end. There is a credit available for this webinar. It's a CCS credit available through the NCBFAA. So if you are an NCBFAA member and you have a CCS accreditation, you can get credit toward that renewal through this webinar. You can just email train@starusa.org after the webinar with your ID number. My name's Jo Harper. I'm a principal here at Star USA. We do a wide variety of trade and compliance, and today we are focusing on education through a little webinar on anti-dumping and countervailing duties. The goal today is to give you a general understanding of anti-dumping and countervailing, whether or not it applies to your products, and a little bit of how to cope if it does. We're going to talk about the legal process of anti-dumping, some of the history, agencies and partners, and the investigation steps. Anti-dumping and countervailing are special duties, and they're equal to the importing country's calculation of the amount of advantage that the importer has gained by selling at a dumped value. And that's collected by the Customs Administration of the importing country. The main difference between anti-dumping and countervailing is the root cause. So these come into play when the domestic industry is harmed by either a foreign seller selling at a low point where the goods are priced at less than fair market value. They may be intentionally losing model in a predatory pricing plan in order to take over the other country's industry or gain a monopoly in that industry. Or they could just be selling outside of their home country at a lower value. And that value is calculated after making adjustments for the international transport costs and the duties. Whereas countervailing duties go after artificially low prices that are a result of subsidies. Governments often offer a lot of these. They could be in the form of tax breaks, they could be in credits, they could be actual payments. And those subsidies allow the exporters to offer lower prices on the goods than domestic producers can offer in those importing countries. And the aim with these duties is to level the playing field and take away an advantage that a foreign producer or exporter may have when compared to domestic producers. The WTO governs what is legal in anti-dumping and countervailing, and there are constantly disputes brought to them between countries as they negotiate out what are fair duties. In order to count as a subsidy, the subsidy has to be an actual financial contribution, provide a measurable benefit to the companies, and be specific to a subset of the companies. So it could be that a government is subsidizing a specific region if there's a area that has historically been lower in production and they want to build that up. It could be an industry, maybe a steel industry or a semiconductor chip industry. It could be export oriented. So we're going to give you money if you promise you're exporting all your products. The main thing is that the domestic industry has to be harmed by this, and the dumping margin or the value margin in the difference has to be greater than 0.5%. An injury is harm which is not inconsequential, immaterial, or unimportant. As you can see, this is not really a specific definition, so it's something that fluctuates and is a case-by-case basis. Anti-dumping has been around since the early 1900s. There was an Anti-Dumping Act that was modeled on antitrust, and it created a private right of action. And then in 1921, there was a law on imports that focused on price discrimination. Our current version was enacted in 1979, and then it was amended in 1995 by the Uruguay Round Agreements Act. That act established the World Trade Organization. Countervailing, on the other hand, has been around for even longer. It started with a sugar situation in the 1890s, and sugar is still a very hot button issue for many countries. And then in 1897, there was a law put in for all goods. In 1979, it was also updated to conform with the Tokyo round of multilateral trade negotiations around the same time that we put in anti-dumping. And it was updated in 1995 also by the Uruguay Round Agreements Act. So these laws have been around for over 100 years in the United States, and they're really to protect domestic industries. Internationally, most countries in the world have some form of anti-dumping or countervailing. We have the current largest number of cases. India and China have the most cases against them. We also have many against us. In ACE, if you pull an overview report of all of the anti-dumping cases, that is a reference 002, I believe, in the ACE report module. There are about 590,000 lines that cover all of the variances between HTS, manufacturers or exporters, and the different duty rates. That includes all the cases. So you can narrow that down. We have 636 open anti-dumping cases with 73 countries. The majority of them are against China by far, 24%. India has 7%, the rest are around 5%. And then there are many that only have 1 or 2, all the others. Some of these cases have been in effect since the 1960s, and duty amounts range from 0%. And the reason they set some at 0% is they're not quite ready to close the case, but some of the manufacturers or some of the parties haven't been dumping, so they don't have a rate assessed. But that could change in the future, so they need to keep that case open at 0%. All the way up to 1,731% anti-dumping. The average anti-dumping rate is around 60%. Then there's 264 open countervailing cases. So we have about 400 more anti-dumping cases than we do countervailing cases. Often you will see anti-dumping and countervailing together because they are both applied, but more frequently there will just be anti-dumping assessed because there is no government subsidy. These are also as old as the 1960s, 1980s. Duty amounts range from 0 to 620% and average around 60%. Again, China is the highest at 32% of those cases. India is 12% and Vietnam is also 5%. There's have been a huge amount of anti-dumping cases added recently. In September of 2020, CBP was enforcing 540 anti-dumping orders, and now we're up to 636. So that's nearly 100 in the last year, year and a half. The government agencies that are involved, the big one on the establishment side is the Department of Commerce. And under the Department of Commerce is the International Trade Commission, which is an independent agency that reports to the USTR, but is still incorporated under the Department of Commerce. The Department of Commerce identifies if there's sales under fair values or subsidies, and then they calculate that margin. Wait, no, sorry. Yeah, the Department of Commerce does. And then the ITC is responsible for determining if there's injury to the domestic industry. Once they've established those things, then they pass this on to CBP to enforce. So cases take a while and they're a little bit confusing because they start with a petition from the domestic industry. So maybe a beet farmer in Pennsylvania says, hey, I can't sell my beets anymore because there's beets coming in from China at a lower cost than I can sustain in my plants. They're harming me. I can't sell my beets. They're all dying in the field. So then the Department of Commerce and the International Trade Commission start out investigating, and they initiate that investigation within 20 days after the petition was filed. If it's countervailing, there is no petition filed. The USTR takes a look and says, hey, we think there's some subsidies and that they're impacting our domestic industry. So initiated up to 20 days after the petition is filed, that's initiated by the Department of Commerce. Then they pass it on to the ITC, and the ITC has some time to make their preliminary determination. So they're going to go out and collect data from the manufacturers on manufacturing cost and pricing. And it can take a little while because sometimes those foreign vendors or manufacturers don't cooperate. And when they don't, then they have to piece together best available information. Then they come back and they either have an affirmative finding that says, yes, dumping is happening and it is problematic for our domestic industry, or they have a negative finding where they say, nope, everything's fine here. If they come back and it is an affirmative finding, then the Department of Commerce takes a look and they say whether or not dumping or countervailing is happening and it's harming people. If both of them come back with an affirmative decision, then they order CBP to suspend liquidation of entries that have that combination of manufacturer or exporter, country, and product. And they give them some guidelines on the typical HTS classifications that those products fit within. And then the importers for those subject entries need to either put up cash deposits or post bonds. An order will be published in the Federal Register, etc. If they say at this point that there are critical circumstances, then the suspension of liquidation is not just ongoing from the date of the order, it's also retroactive, usually about 3 months retroactive. So importers are bringing stuff in, their entries aren't liquidating, and they're responsible for more duties. During that time, the Department of Commerce will do a final determination where they go in, they crunch their numbers a little harder, they get a little more sure, and then they'll pass that off to the International Trade Commission, who will also make their final determination. If they back in the preliminary phase had negative findings, they will still go through these final phases to make absolutely sure that it's a negative finding. Once they have their final numbers, then they'll post their assessment amount, and those payments will be required and the bond can be released. So once that has been finalized, CBP is going to withhold liquidation and collect duties. It often results in the importer needing to get a larger bond, because if you were previously paying 7% duty and all of a sudden, half of your imports are at 60% duty or 500% duty, your bond is likely to be insufficient. Liquidation will stay suspended until the Department of Commerce gives them a specific assessment rate to liquidate. And generally, that suspension is in effect until at least the final results of the annual administrative review that happens after the determination. So it can be up to 4 years from the date of entry until that entry liquidates, which really throws a wrench for a lot of importers in their record keeping cycles, because you have to keep the records from the date of liquidation. And if your entries are on a different calendar for liquidation than your normal entries, it can be tricky. So you have to pay extra attention to record keeping there. And if at any point these orders have to go through judicial review, there will often be extra years added because of multiple remands back to the agencies and appeals. After the investigation is finalized, the Department of Commerce will do an annual review if it's requested, and it takes about 12 to 18 months to complete that. So the annual review can be requested in the 12th month after it has been published. And then after that, takes about 12 to 18 months to get that finalized, because anti-dumping and countervailing duties are based on the amount that happened previously. So they're not based on what you expect to happen in the future. They're based on the last 6 to 12 months of import pricing and leveling that playing field. Then they are legally required every 5 years to do a sunset review, where they go in, they review the whole case, and they determine whether or not revoking the case will result in dumping and subsidies causing injury in the future. And if they see that it will, they keep the case open. If they determine, hey, this industry is now a completely level playing field and we expect it to remain that way, then they will remove the anti-dumping or countervailing case. There are also new shipper reviews. Those can be requested by foreign manufacturers or exporters if they believe their pricing model is more fair or unsubsidized and they are new to the game. They can request a review based on the past 6 to 12 months of activity. Their goal is for that to result in their products having a lower duty amount assessed than the countrywide amount. There are also anti-circumvention reviews. Those reviews clarify the scope of the order to include products that undergo processing or assembly either in the US or in a third country. They might include minor alterations or merchandise that's developed later. Then there are changed circumstances reviews, and that's when the domestic party that requested or the same industry that was identifying injury comes in and says, you know what, we don't want you to enforce duties on these products anymore. Maybe they're not manufacturing them in the future, or maybe they merged with the overseas company. Whatever it is, the domestic industry is saying, please don't cover those anymore. All right, so that's how it works on the government end. We are going to talk about how it goes for importers. Anti-dumping and countervailing has a really big impact on importers. The 2020 fiscal year report for customs showed that 90% of open anti-dumping bills were over $2,000 and nearly 20% of those were greater than $100,000 per bill. And anti-dumping is a customs enforcement priority. The Enforce and Protect Act of 2015 established formal procedures for the industry to submit petitions and customs to investigate those allegations. And then there was a presidential order from 2017 that was establishing enhanced collection and enforcement of ADCVD and violations of trade and custom laws that really put a lot of pressure on customs to find these large revenue potentials and enforce them. They also required that DOJ and Department of Homeland Security develop prosecution practices and allocate resources, because they identify that this is a very big opportunity for revenue generation in the United States. That same report said, all right, in fiscal year 2020, we imported $2.4 trillion, and of those goods, 18.2 billion were subject to anti-dumping. They collected 1.7 billion in anti-dumping and enforced 30 million in penalties. Those penalties were for fraud, gross negligence, and negligence in respect to anti-dumping. And that's about 3% of the total duties that were collected. And they also are really targeting this in enforcement. They're doing entry summary reviews. Those entry summary reviews identified $94.2 million, and audits for anti-dumping discrepancies turned up $203 million. And they also seized shipments of over $1 million. And that was last year. They're continuing it this year. So you have a product. Maybe you're importing a new product and you want to check. So the very first thing that you need to do is be 100% confident in your HTS classification and your origin. And then you can look up the orders. ACE is a great way to check if you're checking just for the HTS classification and or country of origin. You can file that down. There's also several resources for reviewing cases. I put those toward the end of the slides. Once you find an order from that country, you need to look at the scope of the order. So you could check the most recent notice. One of the best things is to sort by most recent. And then you can filter down. You may find the scope in a ruling. You may find the scope in the order. You may find the scope in the investigation. You may find it in the most recent administrative review. It's not the most convenient way of reviewing them. It can be pretty tricky and very paperwork heavy, but that's what you need to do. That's what's required. The scope could be limited by dimensions. It could be limited by chemistry, maybe the end use. Some scopes specifically exclude products that have similar language of describing, like the scope for sticky notes excludes list paper outside of certain dimensions. So make sure you review the whole scope, make sure you review what's excluded, and then toward the end, there's also usually, especially on newer orders, a part about third-party country processing. If you're reviewing the scope and you can't tell, you can go to Department of Commerce for a ruling. You can also check out if there have been any scope rulings in the order previously. So if it's a newer order, probably not. Everyone's in the same boat that you are. If it's an older order, there are often many, many scope rulings, and you can usually find them under the abbreviation SCO. One thing to check in those rulings is whether or not downstream products are included. So the aluminum extrusion order is a really big one. And it covers things that are aluminum extrusions that are not classified in Chapter 76 that are actually other products now. So you have to be really careful as you're reading those. Then if you've determined that it does fall into that scope order, you can determine the duty rate. And the way you do that, start with those most recent administrative reviews, and you search for your specific exporter and or supplier. You should know the manufacturer and the exporter both and be 100% sure in who those are. And you review the order for either of those names. And then if they're not there, you use the countrywide or the all others rate. And keep your records. You need to show that you have done your due diligence on this process. The Customs Mod Act put all of the responsibility for this on the importer of record. It's not on your broker, although they can be a really helpful partner in identifying when they go to file an entry that this combination of country and HTS brings up an anti-dumping flag. They might help identify that, but they are not responsible for that. And that is not the way that Customs wants you to catch that your product is subject. You should be making sure that your bond is sufficient. So if any of your products are subject to anti-dumping, talk to someone, review the bond amount with anti-dumping, and verify that it is set. You should have whether or not the items are subject to dumping or countervailing in your system. It should be in purchase orders. It should be on your invoices. They may be separated out from typical merchandise so that you're 100% sure that you catch them all. You should do regular reviews of order scopes. So if you bring in aluminum extrusions and they have not been subject previously, you should keep an eye on it and make sure that when those annual reviews happen, that scope isn't expanded to cover your items. Give your information to your broker. I'm assuming that importers have a practice where they provide products that they're importing along with HTS origin and other elements that are important, whether or not they're subject to TSCA, etc. Anti-dumping and countervailing should be part of that report. If they are subject, you should be providing the broker with the specific case number that they need to use. And then you should review your broker filings. Check and make sure that they correctly flagged all of the products, especially if you have the same item that's imported from multiple countries, or some are subject and some are not. You want to be sure both that they didn't flag more than were subject and that they got all that were. And then finally, make sure that correct rates are assessed by Customs. We have seen that this is confusing for Customs as well. They will often use the rates from the previous year or from a different manufacturer, etc. You cannot convince Customs whether or not something is in scope. You can only catch it if Customs applies the order incorrectly. Customs is not going to rule on scope that's outside of their purview. Then there is the certificate of reimbursement or non-reimbursement. You need to, if you are bringing in items subject to dumping or countervailing duties, you need to have a certificate that says whether or not you are being reimbursed by the foreign exporter or producer. If you are reimbursed, they double the duties. So if you do not provide the certificate that says that you are not, and you should only say that you are not reimbursed if you are not reimbursed. If you don't provide the certificate, they will assume that you are being reimbursed and they will double the duties when they go to liquidate. It has to be signed by an officer of the company. Your Customs broker cannot do it. And it must match the format that they require. It can be individual or blanket for a time period or for specific entries. and it needs to state there's no payment for the anti-dumping duties. If you are doing a post-summary correction where you're changing your entry type from entry type 1 to entry type 3, entry type 1 is just normal entry and entry type 3 is anti-dumping, you need to submit or make a deposit of duties when you file that PSC. These are options that people like to use. Sometimes they switch a country. They say, all right, there are duties assessed on this from China, so I'm going to move to Malaysia and I'm just going to have them produce there. You cannot just assume that switching a country you're purchasing from takes away the liability. There are many, many products and countries that are subject, and the covered suppliers and the covered countries change. So you need to review each combination individually and keep an eye out and an ear to the ground for what the department is investigating. So often there will be 3 or 4 named countries in an investigation, and they may find for all of them, or they may just find for 1 or 2. It is also frequent that people will write into their purchasing contracts that the supplier cannot provide them with any merchandise that's subject to anti-dumping. And they will try to put that onus onto the foreign supplier. There are many issues with that. The biggest one is that you, as the importer of record, are legally responsible. And the second one is that if it's tricky for a US importer who is familiar with the industry and English is your first language, and you know how customs and other government agencies work here, it is even more complicated for people who are used to dealing with their own government in another country. Don't put that the supplier is responsible for not providing you with merchandise subject to these orders. You can say if they do ship it, you will not accept it, and you can provide them parameters and scopes of orders, etc. But it is ultimately your responsibility. Then there are those that move production. We just talked about the anti-circumvention scopes. A lot of the time, people may think, okay, this order is for really specific items. I can bring these into my warehouse in Mexico or into my factory in Thailand, change them a tiny bit, and then bring them into the US and not pay dumping. That will work probably short term because that's circumvention, and the Department of Commerce is looking out specifically for that. So you want to weigh your benefits and risks carefully and see whether or not the potentially expensive move is beneficial in the short term. One thing we see over and over and over again in anti-dumping and countervailing is that importers are suddenly hit with this 150% duty, and they say, okay, this is bad. This is going to impact my customers. What am I going to do? And one of the options is always, can you purchase domestically? Can you change suppliers? And often it's still not financially equal to change to domestic suppliers. Sometimes there are situations where the products aren't the same, but often even if the products are the same, it's still beneficial to pay the anti-dumping, and that really illustrates how much of a unfair advantage foreign manufacturers may have. So best practices with anti-dumping are having internal controls in writing, have a copy of the orders, include your procedures for monitoring and feedback, and have that management buy-in. It's also important that one person who has authority is responsible for anti-dumping and the relevant knowledge there. If you just have an employee, maybe a shipping clerk, etc., who is responsible for knowing, and they don't have the ability to overrule other departments or get the attention of senior management, you're not going to be successful. You should have internal procedures that assign duties and tasks to a position instead of to a specific person. Very good interdepartmental communication. So when purchasing or engineering is establishing a new product and specifying the design, they're working with compliance to ensure that the product is not subject to any current orders and to suss out whether there are pending orders that are being investigated. Then you conduct and document reviews of anti-dumping and countervailing. If you find out that your broker is misflagging items, you put corrective actions in place and you change your processes and your operations. So if these are best practices, your red flags or concerns are all of the opposite. It's insufficient documentation, not having good definitions, not treating your broker like a trade partner, not having enough authority. Really high turnover in your compliance department is a concern because things will fall through the cracks. If you are changing your HTS, your origin, your description, or the name of the supplier regularly, so say you know who your supplier is and they're constantly sending you invoices under different names, huge red flag. Shell companies, either as the exporter or as the importer, are the biggest way that companies are working around anti-dumping in a very illegal way that is aggressively pursued by the Department of Justice. So don't try it. That's not a cool workaround. Not providing mill certificates for items is another thing that we see where companies are trying to see if customs will just not look more closely if the technical specs aren't there. They're going to look more closely. This is a big revenue stream and they are charged with pursuing it. So they're going to look, they have to look. Another red flag for customs is seeing unusual entry types of merchandise. They're going to check there. Or if there's something funky in your paperwork that shows that you're getting reimbursed somehow, that is a very bad thing. They will go after your bank statements and all of your financial documents to check for that. The biggest thing that they are targeting when they're looking at circumvention and evasion are things like misclassification or undervaluation. That's directly what they're viewing. This is a priority trade initiative. If they identify a product on an entry, they can go back 5 years on those products. And when they do, that can be extremely expensive. If you get a CF-28 from customs, a CF-28 is a request for information. So if you get one of those from customs that says, hey, we think that anti-dumping applies, get some help. You should be carefully reviewing that claim that the products are subject and then reviewing the scope. CBP often will not change their mind if they took an action. They require a formal ruling from Department of Commerce, which can be expensive. Use your experts unless it is very, very clearly not in scope. We have been successful if they're just fishing and they're checking, saying, hey, it's not, here's the documents, why, then that's cool. But if there's any question about whether or not it's in scope, customs isn't going to determine that. They're going to say, yes, it is. And if you disagree, go to Department of Commerce. Scope rulings with Department of Commerce can take years, actual years. And while those are happening, customs will assess duties on all of those entries. There is potential, if you have to do that, to, once you get that CF-28, file a prior disclosure. That will prevent penalties, and it will also kind of allow you to put pause on that while you work with Commerce and file a scope ruling. Listen very carefully to what your supplier is recommending, and if your customers are telling you, oh no, these aren't subject from your competitors, there's probably some circumvention or evasion happening. Keep an eye out for that. You can, if you are not able to compete and you know that people are violating the laws, you can go to Commerce or ITC and say, hey, look at this. This is, people are not doing what the law requires. You can't file drawback for anti-dumping or countervailing duties, even if you bring it in and you export it completely unused. And if you admit ADCVD subject merchandise into a foreign trade zone, you have to admit it in privileged foreign status. So that means even if you manufacture it further in the FTZ, you still have to pay anti-dumping on the state it was when it was first admitted. Okay, so say you're bringing in some thermal paper from Spain, and you know the HTS, you know that it's duty free. You can then look up Spain and see if they have any anti-dumping cases. They do. They have one on paper either in jumbo rolls or converted rolls. And then it goes through a whole bunch of specifics. So you would need to get from your purchasing or engineering, does it have a base coat? Does it have a thermal active coating? Yep, okay, ours has thermal coating. Doesn't have a top or a base coat. Unfortunately, that means it's still within the scope of the order. Then it goes into jumbo rolls. Jumbo rolls are 4.5 inches or more in width. Unfortunately, and ours is only 3 inches. But if you keep reading, converted rolls have a width less than 4.5 inches. Ours is 3 inches. And it does specify a GSM weight. So far, ours is in scope. And you can also see that if you have a jumbo roll and you bring it into another country and cut it down, it's still subject to anti-dumping. It gives a couple classification options, and then it says what all orders say. We're providing HTS for convenience and customs, but the written scope is what matters. And then it gives 2 rates. So we have one for, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. It's a specific manufacturer or exporter at 41%. Ours is not from that, and we're sure that it's not from that. So we would go with the all others rate of 37%. So often the all others rate is higher, but sometimes it's lower because it's based on who responded out of the mandatory respondents. So it could be that this company didn't respond and the Department of Commerce just assumed the worst of them. So again, you want to be really, really sure that the party you're saying it's from is actually the party it's from. I really recommend, if you are dealing with anti-dumping, get some expert help. If you think that it's within scope, or you're pretty sure it's not, or you're wanting to set up a program, this stuff is very complicated and it can take a little while to get the hang of it. You should also be reviewing regularly, at least quarterly. Take a look at your products, take a look at the orders, make sure you're confident and comfortable and everything is documented. And be proactive. That's really important. Here are some resources. The links will be on the slides when they come out. There's a handbook by the ITC, it really goes over the investigation process. So it's not super helpful from an importer perspective, but it is from a domestic industry perspective. Then there are multiple spaces where you can get scope information by country from the ITA, and a link to access, which you can sign up for an account with. It's free, it's simple, where you can view all of the documents about a specific case and you can kind of track it. There are a couple overviews of anti-dumping with CBP, and the priority trade issue page has several resources. Then there is how to look up anti-dumping in ACE. There's a report. There's also a couple of search functionalities. There are a couple of instructions in ACE. The FAQ on the CBP website is very, very helpful. And then there's also just a fun, interesting Department of Commerce link to US products that are subject to foreign anti-dumping. I'm going to take some questions and review that. We're going to stop the recording while we do that. Again, reminder, if you have a CCS or CES, you can get accreditation for that. Just email us. You can join us next time for a live Q&A after the webinar. Also, email us if you have any questions. We just gave a really general overview, so if you have specifics, please get in touch with us. And as always, thank you so much for spending your time with us. We hope this was helpful.